The desert never promised kindness. It never promised rain or mercy or anything except what it already was, endless, dry, and waiting. Tombstone, Arizona had a way of teaching a man that simple fact, and Caleb Thorne had learned it well. He woke before the sun most mornings, not because he wanted to, but because silence made sleep restless. Silence carried memories, and Caleb had plenty of those. That morning, the boards of the porch groaned under his boots as he stepped out, tin cup of coffee in his hand. He squinted at the horizon. It was the kind of dawn that pressed down on a man's shoulders, heavy still and hot before the day even started. He expected nothing more than the sight of his cattle grazing thin against the scrubland, or maybe a hawk circling for breakfast. What he saw instead froze him where he stood. Near the split-rail fence just off the worn trail leading in from the south sat a wagon. Not a fresh one. The wheels leaned tired, the canvas top ripped in half like something had clawed at it. A mule stood tied to the post ribs, sharp as barrel hoops, chewing at air, like it had been waiting too long for someone who'd never arrive. There were no tracks, no driver, no dust trailing off in the distance. Just that wagon and the quiet that wrapped around it. Caleb set his cup down, slow, his jaw tightening. Things didn't just appear out here. Every mark in the dirt had a story boot, prints, hoof lines, wagon wheels, but the ground was empty, clean, as if the desert itself had swallowed whoever brought it. He crossed the yard each step, careful boots crunching in the dirt. The smell hit first, sweat, blood, old fear that clung to the air heavier than dust. He stopped at the wagon, one hand resting on the woodside. There was a knot of rope tied to the back beam and stuck into it a folded note. Two words written in a scrawl that made his stomach twist. Paid in full. Underneath, smaller property delivered. Caleb's breath left in a slow, sharp hiss. He hadn't ordered anything. And even if he had, no decent man sent property across the desert without a name or a knock. He pulled the rope loose, the note slipping into his pocket as his eyes turned to the torn canvas. The boards creaked as he climbed up one hand, pushing back the flap. That was when he saw her. A girl or no, a young woman, maybe no older than 20. Dirt streaked her face, lips split and dry. Her wrists were bound raw, her skin marked by bruises that spoke of fists and rope more than chance. The rise and fall of her chest was shallow, like her body wasn't sure it wanted to keep going. And across her back, barely visible through torn cloth, were scars. Deep, angry, deliberate. Her eyelids fluttered. A sound rough as gravel left her throat. Her gaze found him not pleading, not begging, just hollow. Empty, like someone who had already seen the end of things and lived past it. And then, with lips cracked and trembling, she whispered words that would brand themselves into Caleb's bones. "You paid for me. Now finish it." Caleb froze. The desert wind didn't move. The mule stopped chewing. Time itself seemed to draw tight like a noose. He didn't answer. Didn't flinch. He just looked at her because there was nothing to say to that kind of brokenness. Some men had seen war and thought they knew hell. Caleb had ridden through battlefields littered with torn bodies, heard the screams of boys too young to shave. But this was something colder. Hell wasn't fire and gunpowder. Hell was a human being delivered to your door, carved up and discarded, with the world calling it a favor. He cut the rope from her wrists. They were thin, too thin, with grooves carved deep into the skin. He caught her before she fell, lifting her out of the wagon, as careful as if she were glass about to shatter. Her weight was nothing less than a sack of feed, but the burden pressed heavier than any he'd carried from war. The boards of the porch groaned again when he stepped back inside the girl in his arms. He laid her down on the cot in the spare room, the one that hadn't seen company in years. He pulled a blanket over her, set a tin cup of water within reach. For a long while he just stood there, hat in his hand, staring at the rise and fall of her chest. There were no answers in her breathing, no reason why she had been left here. Only that note in his pocket and the truth written across her skin. Caleb turned away, his throat dry. For the first time in years, the man who had lived through war loss, in the empty miles of the desert, found himself at a loss. He didn't know whether to curse to ride out or to kneel by her side. All he knew was this: the West had delivered him something darker than bullets and blood, and it was breathing right there in his house. The room had 4 things in it: a cot, a chair, a pitcher, and the quiet. The quiet did most of the work. Caleb set the chair by the doorway so he wouldn't crowd her. He left his hat on the hook and his gun belt on the nail by the kitchen door, because men who carried iron into sick rooms never brought anything but trouble. He boiled water. The kettle clicked and hissed like a tired snake. He laid out what he had: clean rags, a small tin of salve, and a spool of thread for patching shirts that might have to pretend it was meant for skin. He didn't touch her right away. He didn't even speak. The first law with animals and people both was this: don't startle. Let them remember the shape of the room without fear. Let the air settle around them as if it meant them no harm. She slept like a hunted thing. The kind of sleep that breaks apart the second a floorboard sighs or a hinge breathes. Twice in that first afternoon, her body jerked hard enough to pull a whisper out of him. The third time she woke in a panic and the cot leg wrapped the floor. He kept his hands open and in front of him where she could see them. "You're safe," he said, though the words felt flimsy to him, like paper in a rainstorm. He left a tin cup of water on the crate by the cot and went back to his chair in the hall. Every few minutes he checked the doorway and then returned to stillness the way a man checks the horizon for weather he can't control. Late in the day, she turned her head toward the cup. The effort dragged a frown across her brow. She tried to sit. He stood but didn't step in. She made it halfway and trembled, caught between will and weakness. Only then did he move slow, deliberate palms out a man approaching a skittish mare. "May I?" he asked. Her eyes held on him like a knife waits in a sheath. She said nothing, but she didn't turn away when he slid an arm behind her shoulders and lifted. Bone and heat. That's what she felt like. Bone and heat and the grit of the road still clinging to her skin. He put the cup to her lips. She drank too fast and choked. He waited. She tried again, slower. The second swallow reached a place in her that had been desert for too long. When he eased her back, she kept looking at him as if he'd pull some cost out of her next breath. He didn't. He stepped back to the door. In the evening, he cooked beans and bacon. The smell rolled through the cabin, and he saw her nostrils flare. He spooned a small portion into a tin bowl and brought it to the threshold. "Food," he said. "I'll leave it here." He crouched and set the bowl down and returned to the kitchen table without looking over his shoulder. A long time passed. A coyote yipped far off as if laughing at men and their plans. When he finally rose to rinse his own plate, the bowl in the doorway was empty. He set it aside with a quiet nod no one saw. Night dragged its slow chain across the roof. The desert cooled and the wood creaked the way old houses confess things in the dark. She slept some. So did he, leaning in the chair with his arms crossed, hat pulled low enough to steal a few minutes at a time. Once near dawn, she made a sound that was too small for crying and too sharp to be anything else. He didn't go in. He let the sound pass through both of them and out the window where it could disperse among the mesquite. The next morning he warmed water and set a basin by the cot. He waited in the doorway until she raised her eyes. "There's salve," he said, "for the skin." He kept his voice level, the way you talk to a horse before you cut a burr out of its mane. "If you want help, I can. If not, I'll bring a mirror." She stared at the basin as if it might tell her what to do. Then she nodded toward the door, a flick of the chin that meant go. So he did. He left the room and listened to the water move tiny waves, cloth wrung and wrung again. Air pulled through teeth to keep from calling out when salt met wound. When he stepped out to check the stock, the sun already had its hands at his throat. The mule from the wagon stood dull-eyed by the trough. He untied the rope and let the animal drink while he combed burrs from its tail and read the story with his fingers, rubbed raw, hide the high ridge of worry along the spine, a spot where the harness had gnawed too long. Whoever tied that note to Caleb's life hadn't spared thought for beasts any more than for people. He mended a fence rail and thought of nothing. Not the war, not the woman in the spare room, not the barrel of the world that never seemed to stop rolling men under. When he came back, a square of sunlight lay on the floorboards beside the cot. She had managed to slide her legs over the edge and sit upright. The effort had bled her pale, but she was sitting, and that was more than the morning had promised. He brought bread and a sliver of jerky softened in broth. She ate like someone paying attention to each bite for the first time in months. He saw her eyes flick to the doorway, to the corridor, to his hands. Every movement in the room still had to be measured, weighed, and approved by whatever tribunal lived inside her now. "Name's Caleb," he said finally. He didn't stick his hand out. Names were enough to start with. She looked at him, and he knew he'd asked for nothing and everything at once. "Eliza," she said. The word came out careful, as if she hadn't used it in a while. He repeated it in his head, "Eliza," and felt something settle. A name gives a person edges. It keeps them from slipping through the cracks in a man's understanding. Through that second day, he did small things. He aired the blanket and turned the mattress so the worn spot would be under her knees instead of her spine. He swept the floor of grit she'd never tracked in, but would be blamed for anyway, by the part of the mind that likes to count what's missing. He put a fresh shirt on the peg by the door, in case she wanted cloth that wasn't soaked with someone else's road. He kept his distance. When the salve needed to be spread across the torn places on her back, he set the tin on the crate and said, "I can call the midwife from 2 miles over if you want. She's good and she don't gossip." Eliza's eyes went flat at the word call, as if calling had been a mistake the last time that put a knife's opinion into her skin. She shook her head once. He didn't argue. Some wounds were a country a man couldn't enter without doing more harm. Late afternoon, a wind rose and rattled the cottonwoods along the wash. Dust slid under the door and made lines like scripture on the floor. He poured coffee and sat in his chair. Eliza's gaze moved between the window and the fire, as if light needed watching. When the kettle rattled again, he refilled his cup, and then after a hesitation that lasted the span of 2 breaths, poured a small cup and set it on the crate. He didn't offer it by hand. He didn't hover. He walked back to the doorway and leaned his shoulder there. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Her fingers worried the edge of the blanket, twisting and smoothing as if making a place flat could keep the day from folding wrong. The room held them both that way for a time, the sound of wind, the crackle of a log, the pause before a thing that might or might not happen. When she finally spoke, it startled him, not because of the sound, but because of the shape of the words. "You didn't touch me." It was not accusation, not gratitude. It was a line drawn in the sand to see what he would do next. Caleb set his cup on the floor and let the question stand up all by itself. He could have given a sermon about right and wrong, about what men were supposed to be and why most weren't. He could have said he'd seen enough taking to last the rest of his days. He could have said war taught him the cost of hands used for the wrong kind of work. He said none of that. He lifted his eyes to hers, calm as a water trough on a windless morning, and answered the only way that didn't spend her trust like small coins. "I ain't most men." The wind shouldered the house and then stepped back. Somewhere outside, a hinge clicked. Eliza's shoulders lowered the slightest fraction, the way a hawk relaxes when it learns the hand near it means to feed, not cage. She didn't smile. He didn't expect her to. But the air in the room changed, less iron in it, more bread. After that, words were rationed. He asked if the light hurt her eyes. She shook her head. He asked if the scars pulled when she breathed. She nodded. He asked if she wanted him to read a little from the old family Bible, not for sermon, just for a voice in the room that wasn't sand and wind. She looked at the cover as if it were a door. "No," she said softly, and then, after a beat, "Not yet." When dusk came, he lit the lamp and turned it low. He stacked wood by the stove so no noise would be necessary in the night. He left the door to the spare room half open so the hallway would hold both of their heartbeats and prove neither one had stopped. Before he took his chair, he paused at the threshold. "If you need," he said, and tugged his ear once, a boyish gesture he hadn't used in years, meaning "I'll hear." Eliza's eyes went to the lamp to the window back to him. "I'll try to sleep," she said, and that was the bravest thing in the room. He sat and watched the night arrive, not as a threat, but as a blanket thrown across the roof by a careful hand. The desert had a dozen cruel ways to test a man. This, he realized, was the one that mattered: to hold still and be kind when everything in you wanted to move or fix or run. To be a wall someone could lean against without the wall wanting something back. The quiet did the rest. The desert marked time not with clocks, but with light. The third morning came gold and sharp through the cracks in the shutters, laying stripes across the floor of the spare room. Caleb set down a plate of biscuits and salt pork on the crate by the cot. He waited, arms folded back, pressed against the doorframe. Eliza's eyes opened, slow, wary as ever. But this time she didn't flinch at the sound of his boots. She reached for the food with hands that still trembled, though steadier than before. He watched without comment. Watching was what he did best. By the end of that week, she was walking from one end of the room to the other. She took the broom from his hands one afternoon, brushed the dirt from the floorboards in short, sharp strokes. When he came back from watering the stock, she had set 2 cups on the table. One for him, one for herself. No words, just 2 cups. He sat, drank, and the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was something else, something closer to peace. But peace never lasted in the West. It was during one of those quiet evenings when he saw them again, the scars. She had been reaching for a rag near the basin, her blouse slipping from her shoulder. The firelight cut across her back, and Caleb's jaw tightened. The wounds were too neat to be accidents, so too deliberate. The cuts had healed into letters twisted but legible, a single word carved deep enough into flesh that time itself hadn't erased it. Worthless. The words seemed to burn in the air between them. Eliza froze when she realized he'd seen. For a heartbeat, she looked like she might strike him or bolt through the door, though she had nowhere to run. But Caleb didn't move. He didn't even draw a breath loud enough to notice. He only looked at the fire jaw, clenched hands resting flat on his knees. After a long silence, Eliza spoke. Her voice wasn't strong. It was a splinter dragged across wood. It wasn't random. He didn't ask, but she went on as if the scars themselves had demanded explanation. I worked in the big house of the county official. Clean clothes, long hours. Not so bad at first. Then came the gambling, the debts. When he couldn't pay, he put me on the table like a coin, said I'd cover what he owed. Her words broke and came back jagged. They tied me, marked me, like I was a calf for branding. They wanted me to remember, wanted everyone else to see it too. She paused, then spat the word like it was poison on her tongue. Worthless. The fire cracked. Caleb's fingers curled slow against his knees. He had seen men gutted in war. He had buried comrades under dirt so thin the coyotes dug them up by dawn. But this was not war. War had at least carried purpose, however ugly. This was cowardice. Rot disguised in lawman's boots. Eliza's shoulders trembled. She didn't cry. The tears had dried long before Tombstone. What she wanted wasn't pity. It was proof that someone believed. Caleb rose without a word, crossed the room, and when she braced, like he might raise a hand, he only set a folded blanket by the cot. Then he turned, went to the table, and pulled out ink, quill, and paper. He wrote slow, careful, each letter steady as a rifle sight. When he finished, his hands were stained black. He left the page in the center of the table, where she could see it, a letter addressed to a man in Tucson. Captain Nathan Hale, an old Army friend who carried weight at the garrison now. Caleb didn't look at her. He didn't explain. But the message was clear. He wasn't going to bury her story in silence. He was going to drag it into daylight. Eliza stared at the letter, her breath catching. No smile, no relief. But in her eyes, for the first time, there was something close to hope. Not the bright kind that makes a girl sing, but the faint, stubborn kind that keeps a body breathing one more day. For Caleb, it was enough. That night, they sat by the fire. Eliza didn't speak for a long while. She kept her eyes on the flame's shoulders, tight lips pressed together, like she might split apart if she opened them. Caleb sipped his coffee, patient. Silence was an old companion. He could sit with it forever if she needed. Then, soft and tired, she said, "You didn't ask me." Caleb lifted his gaze. Didn't need to. Her eyes flickered, uncertain. Most men would have. He tossed another log into the fire. The sparks rose, red and fleeting. His voice came low, steady. "I ain't most men." This time she believed him. The desert had its own way of warning a man. Sometimes it was a shift in the wind, sometimes the restless stamping of a horse before the rider appeared. Caleb Thorne didn't need either. He felt it in his chest that evening, the same tightness he used to feel before the first cannon blast on a battlefield. Trouble was coming. The sun was low, bleeding itself across the ridges when he saw the rider. A single man, dust curling behind his horse like smoke. Hat pulled low back, straight, the kind of posture that said he believed the land owed him passage. Caleb leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't reach for the rifle propped by the door. Not yet. The rider came close enough that Caleb saw the smirk cut across his mouth. He pulled on the reins, boots hitting dirt with the kind of thud that meant he wanted to be heard. "Delivery make it safe?" the man asked, voice slick as grease. Caleb didn't answer. He only watched. The stranger tipped his hat back, eyes sharp and cold. "Girl should have been here 2 weeks ago. Took some convincing to get her loose. But business is business. You've had your sample now, I'll be taking her back." Inside the cabin, Eliza froze. She had been at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of water. At the sound of that voice, the cup slipped. Water spilled across the wood as she ducked toward the corner, breath sharp, shoulders trembling. Caleb's jaw tightened. He set the tin cup down on the porch rail with deliberate care. "She ain't yours," Caleb said. The stranger's grin widened. "Not yours either. Don't matter what you think. She's property, and I'm here to collect." He stepped toward the door. That was as far as he got. Caleb moved like a door slamming in a storm. One step, fist in the man's collar, the other hand pulling iron so fast the barrel was cold, under the stranger's chin before he knew what hit him. The man's smirk broke, eyes flashing wide. "No shouting," Caleb said, voice low. "No show. You're done." He shoved the man backward into the cabin's steel, never leaving skin. In 2 breaths, the stranger was on the floor, wrists bound tight with the same rope he'd no doubt used on others. Caleb shoved a rag between his teeth to cut off the curses. Eliza stayed in the corner, eyes wide, watching something she had never seen before. Someone standing between her and the men who treated her like a coin tossed in a game. Her breath shook, but her shoulders straightened the tiniest bit. Caleb tied the man to the post outside, left him gagged under the empty stars. The desert had its way of teaching arrogance. No water, no shelter, just the weight of silence pressing down. Caleb sat on the porch, shotgun across his lap, and waited for dawn. The night dragged. Coyotes yipped at the edges of the property. The mule from the wagon stamped its hooves nervously, as if remembering its last master. Eliza didn't sleep. She sat by the window watching Caleb's silhouette against the fire he'd lit in the yard. For the first time, she let herself breathe, knowing the night might pass without hands grabbing her from the dark. When the sky broke pale with morning dust, rose again from the horizon. Not a lone rider this time, soldiers. 6 men from Tucson, blue coats stained with desert grit. Caleb stood as they rode in his letter, ready, his captive bound to the post. The officer in charge dismounted, recognition in his eyes when Caleb gave his name. They took the prisoner without question, reading guilt plain in the man's face. The letter sealed it. Eliza stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders. She watched as the soldiers hauled the man away, his curses muffled in the gag. And for the first time in years, she felt the fight was not hers alone to carry. Somebody had stood with her. The world finally had listened. Caleb said nothing. He didn't look at her. He only watched the soldiers disappear into the desert haze, his jaw tight, his hands loose by his side. Inside, the cabin felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. The desert had a way of swallowing sound. By the time the hoofbeats of the Tucson soldiers faded, there was nothing left but the hush of wind scraping across sand. Caleb Thorne stood on the porch, hands resting on the rail, eyes on the horizon where the prisoners had vanished. He didn't move for a long while. Inside the cabin, the air felt lighter, though neither of them quite knew what to do with it. Eliza was the first. She stepped out of the doorway, blanket pulled close around her shoulders, bare feet brushing against the worn boards. She looked at the spot where the man had been tied, the rope still hanging loose, a reminder that chains were not just metal, but memory. Her eyes lingered, then shifted to Caleb. "You handed him over," she said quietly. Caleb's gaze didn't leave the horizon. Didn't need another grave on this land. The words were simple, but behind them lay all the things he didn't say. That he could have killed the man without blinking. That a younger version of himself might have done it. That war had taught him there were better punishments than death. Proof. Witnesses. Justice carried by more than one set of hands. Eliza nodded, though her lips trembled like the desert grass when the wind rose. For the first time in too long, she felt like someone believed her scars were evidence, not shame. That evening she cooked. Nothing grand, just beans in the pot and bread browned over the fire. Caleb watched her move about the kitchen, still careful, still hesitant, but moving nonetheless. Each small gesture was its own rebellion, choosing to stir, to serve, to place plates on the table like she belonged there. When she set a bowl in front of him, their eyes met. Caleb inclined his head in a slow, respectful nod. She didn't look away this time. She sat across from him, shoulders straighter than they had been, hands resting on the table, like they had a right to be seen. The silence that followed wasn't the same silence of before. It wasn't heavy with fear or broken things. It was clean. Days passed. No more strangers came to the door. No more shadows lingered at the edges of the yard. Caleb rose with the sun, worked the land-mended fences. Eliza began to join him in small ways, filling the trough, brushing the horses, sweeping the porch. One morning while he carried hay bales, he heard it, a sound he hadn't expected, humming, soft, low, and almost unsure of itself. Eliza was at the wash, scrubbing cloth, her lips moving, with a tune that wasn't a hymn he knew, nor a soldier's march, but something older, half lullaby, half prayer. Caleb paused, hands on the bale, listening. It was the first time the cabin had known music in years. He didn't say a word, didn't let her know he'd heard. Some sounds were too fragile to name aloud. That night by the fire, she spoke again. Her voice was steadier now, though her eyes stayed on the flames. When you wrote that letter, you didn't even know me. Caleb stared into his coffee. Didn't need to. She swallowed, fingers tightening around her cup. Most men would have turned away. He leaned back in his chair, the fire painting lines across his face. Most men ain't the measure I use. For the first time, she let out something close to a laugh. Short, broken, but real. The sound startled her as much as him. She covered her mouth as if laughter was too bold for someone carved with the word worthless. Caleb only nodded, a small acknowledgement, like he'd been waiting for that sound. The nights grew easier. She no longer woke at every creak of the boards. She no longer flinched when his boots struck the floor. There were still shadows, still moments when her eyes went distant and her hands shook, but they passed quicker now. Caleb didn't push. He never asked for stories she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he gave her small anchors, chores, food, coffee in the mornings, the steady rhythm of work. And in return, she gave him something he hadn't known he was missing. Company. Not the loud kind, not the demanding kind, but the simple fact that someone else was breathing in the same room and choosing to stay. One evening, as the desert sky turned purple and the coyotes started their distant choir, Eliza stood by the porch rail. Caleb joined her, leaning against the post. Neither spoke for a while. The land stretched endless in every direction, unforgiving, yet somehow calmer now. Finally, she said, "When I was branded, I thought it was the end of my story. I thought it would follow me forever." Caleb glanced at her, then back to the horizon. "Scars don't end a story. They prove you kept walking." She looked at him, then eyes glistening in the firelight. No words came, but she didn't need them. The silence said enough. That night, she slept with the door to her room left open. Not out of fear, but out of trust. And Caleb, sitting in his chair, hat tipped low, let the quiet fill the cabin once again. But this time, it wasn't a coffin's quiet. It was the sound of healing beginning to breathe. The days stretched longer now, not because the sun burned hotter, but because the weight pressing on the cabin had lifted. For the first time since the wagon appeared at his fence, Caleb Thorne's ranch didn't feel like a place waiting for ghosts. It felt lived in. Eliza had begun to leave traces of herself scattered through the house. A braid of wildflowers drying by the window. A folded piece of cloth mended with stitches too neat to be Caleb's. The faint sound of her voice when she thought she was alone, whispering songs that didn't belong to church pews or tavern halls, but to some corner of her childhood she hadn't yet lost. Caleb noticed these things, though he never mentioned them. He understood that healing was quiet work, the kind that grew in the spaces left unspoken. One morning she joined him by the corral. The horses shifted nervously, but her hand was steady on their necks. She brushed them in long, patient strokes, her touch more sure than her voice had ever been. Caleb leaned on the fence, arms folded, and watched. "They trust you," he said finally. Eliza glanced at him, a wisp of a smile tugging at her mouth. "Animals don't lie. They either fear you or they don't." He nodded, "Same as people." Her eyes softened at that, but she didn't answer. The moment stretched between them like a thread, thin but strong. By the end of the second week, Eliza had claimed a rhythm of her own. She cooked without being asked, hung clothes in the sun, drew water from the well. Small things, but each one declared something larger. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's home. She was living. Caleb felt it too. The silence they shared had shifted. It no longer pressed on his chest like iron. It felt more like the space two people gave each other when words weren't needed. Still, there were nights when the past clawed its way back. He heard her stir, muffled cries biting through the thin walls. Caleb never entered. Instead, he stoked the fire, let the glow push back the shadows, and left the warmth to drift toward her room. She never thanked him, but the next mornings her eyes carried less of the storm. It was near sundown, weeks after the soldiers had ridden off with her captor, that Eliza finally spoke what had been circling in her chest. They were seated by the fire. Caleb sipped coffee, Eliza turning a piece of bread in her hands without eating. The flames cast their faces in amber and shadow. She broke the silence softly. "I should leave." Caleb didn't look up. He waited. Her voice faltered, then steadied. "I've thought about it. Leaving would mean they win. I'd be running from a place that gave me choice. Here, no one orders me, no one trades me, no one brands me." She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I want to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because for the first time I can decide." The words hung in the air, fragile but firm. Caleb set his cup down slow. He turned toward her, studying her face. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't begging for a place. She was claiming her life with a voice scarred but unbroken. He gave the smallest nod, slow and deliberate. Eliza exhaled, shoulders lowering as though she'd been holding her breath for weeks. She looked into the fire, then her lips parting, just slightly, almost like she might smile. Caleb leaned back, eyes on the flames. He said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, Eliza slept with the window open. The desert air moved through the room, cool and steady, carrying no scent of rope or blood, just sagebrush and starlight. And in the next room, Caleb sat in his chair, hat tipped low, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was the sound of someone choosing to live, and in the quiet of that cabin, it was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The desert never erased its marks. Wind could smooth a dune, rain could carve a canyon, but the land always remembered what passed across it. People were no different. Caleb Thorne knew that. Eliza knew it more. Weeks had settled into something like a life. The cabin no longer felt like a place waiting for death. It carried the weight of footsteps, the clatter of dishes, the small sound of a woman's hum while she worked. Caleb didn't name it out loud. Naming things sometimes made them fragile, but he felt the difference in his bones. One evening, as the fire snapped and the sky outside bled into stars, Eliza sat with her back half turned to him. Her blouse had slipped and the firelight traced the scars across her shoulders. The word carved into her flesh glared as it always did, worthless. But tonight she didn't pull the fabric up. She let it show. Caleb's eyes lingered, not with pity, not with disgust, just with a quiet recognition that scars told truths words couldn't. At last she spoke, voice steady. I used to think this was all I'd ever be, that no matter where I went, this word would speak louder than me. Her hand hovered over the scars but didn't touch. But now, I see it different. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He didn't interrupt. It doesn't say what I am, she whispered. It says what I survived. The fire crackled like it agreed. Caleb nodded once. Scars don't end a story. They prove you kept walking. Her throat caught, but she met his gaze. For the first time, the hollowness in her eyes had been filled with something else, defiance maybe, or the fragile beginnings of peace. The days rolled on. They built fences together, cooked side by side, tended the stock. Sometimes Eliza laughed, small at first, then fuller. Each sound was a stone set into a new foundation, one Caleb hadn't thought possible when he found her in that wagon. Neighbors began to notice too. A woman seen at Thorne's ranch, a voice answering when his name was called at the fence line. Tombstone was a town that whispered, but this time Caleb didn't care. Let them whisper. One night as the kettle hissed and the coyotes sang at a distance, Eliza turned to him. Her face was softer in the lamplight. You gave me back more than I thought I had left, she said. Caleb shook his head. You did that yourself. She tilted her head, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. No, I survived. But you believed I was worth more than the word on my back. That's different. He didn't argue. Some truths didn't need shaping. Outside, the desert spread endless, still cruel, still unforgiving. But inside the cabin, in the sound of a woman's quiet laughter and the steady scrape of a man's boots on the floor, something stronger than cruelty had taken root. Not romance, not yet. Something deeper. A fragile kind of family forged not by blood, but by choice. Caleb tipped his hat lower, watching the fire burn low. Eliza sat across from him, her scars lit in soft orange glow. No longer hidden, no longer the only thing that defined her. In that silence, heavy with everything unsaid, Caleb understood something the war had never taught him. Strength wasn't measured in guns drawn or enemies buried. It was measured in kindness offered when the world expected cruelty. And Eliza, staring into the fire, understood something too. The scars she carried weren't the end of her story. They were the proof she had survived to write the rest. When dawn came, the desert stretched wide and empty again. But for the first time, neither of them felt alone standing in it.